jumping in this evening. We are just going to give it a few minutes to let folks jump into the webinar today, and then we will take it away. So hold tight. Okay. Perfect. All righty. Well, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Good evening. It's actually starting to get dark here in Montana, which is a sign of the seasons changing. And we are so grateful for you to join us this evening for our live virtual events with Books in Common. We are so excited to be here tonight with Vanessa Veselka and Peter Geye. We are also grateful to be here in this virtual space with our fellow Books in Common sponsoring bookstores, Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Before we get to Vanessa and Peter, we want to point out a few things about this virtual space. We are recording this event and it will be viewable on booksincommonnw.com, as well as the Books in Common NW YouTube channel after the event concludes. There will be a link in the chat here in just a moment to buy a copy of both authors' books to show your support for them and for Books in Common. Just visit that link and select your favorite sponsoring store to pick up your books by clicking on the logos at the bottom. If you have any questions for either or both authors, just click the little Q&A button that's either at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on which device you are viewing us on this evening. You can also view the questions that other folks have asked and vote on the questions you think are the best or that you would really like to know. You're also welcome to leave comments and questions in the chat room just there to the right. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend just exiting and re-entering the meeting, the webinar. And if you can't get back in for some reason, do just switch over to that YouTube channel. You should be able to see it live there. Also, if you're having trouble with sound, we recommend headphones. It just tends to make things easier. And we do want to remind you that this is a shared creative space, that we want to remain safe for everyone involved, and ask that you be respectful for everyone that's joined us tonight. Offensive or inappropriate comments or questions will see the user dismissed from this space. So to begin, Vanessa Veselka is the author of the novel Zazen, as well as her newest one, The Great Offshore Grounds. Zazen won the Penn and Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her short stories have appeared in Tin House and ZYZZYVA, and her nonfiction in GQ, The Atlantic, and Smithsonian. She has been at various times a teenage runaway, a sex worker, a union organizer, and an independent record label owner, a train hopper, a waitress, and a mother. She lives in Portland, Oregon with a and The Great Offshore Grounds is a wildly original cross-country novel that subverts the long tradition of family narratives and casts new light on the mythologies, national and individual and collective, that drive and define us. So we'll hear more about that in a moment, but we also have with us this evening Peter Geye, who received his MFA from the University of New Orleans and his PhD from Western Michigan, where he's the editor of Third Coast. Geye is the author of the award-winning novels Safe from the Sea, The Lighthouse Road, and Wintering, the winner of the Minnesota Book Award. He currently teaches the year-long novel writing project at the Loft Literary Center. Born and raised in Minneapolis, he continues to live there with his family. And Peter's new book, Northernmost, is a thrilling ode to the spirit of adventure and the vagaries of loss and love, braiding together two remarkable stories of love and survival separated by more than a century. Northernmost wades into the darkest recesses of the human heart and celebrates the remarkable ability of humans to endure nearly unimaginable trials. Now, without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to Vanessa and Peter.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Peter.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Vanessa.
Well, so what we're going to try to do here is that Peter and I have been talking. We're both really big fans of each other's work. And so we're going to present each other's work a little bit. And I'm going to try to talk about what Peter's book is about, give some context and lead through that. He's going to do the same for me. And we'll see how it goes, because apparently both of us are really bad about contextualizing and giving the sort of elevator pitch version of our own books. So
we should
did
also
I get that right?
I think that's exactly right. And we should add that we just decided this like 3 or 4 minutes ago. So this is totally unscripted, totally unprepared. But I'm looking forward to it and to the conversation in general. I've been dying to meet you and to talk about this book from the time I read it, which is, I don't even remember now, like first read it, I should say, 6 or 7 months ago or whenever it was when I read it as a galley. And I just can't wait. It's going to be so much fun to talk about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So should I start and give a try on yours?
Yeah. Then yeah. You go first. Exactly.
Okay. I will go first. So this is probably going to come up looking backwards. Does it come up looking backwards?
Oh, that looks right.
Oh, okay. So this is Northernmost, and it's Peter's new book, and it's the third in a trilogy. And I'm a bit at a disadvantage because this was the first one of yours that I've read, but I think it's one of the real strong marks of a book that comes in that form, that you don't need the other two to make it make sense. It just is. It means that you go in a circle of time, particularly with your work. I think that's true, as it spans generations. And so I'm very much looking forward to reading the other two. This book follows two main narratives, one that's happening in 1897 and one that's happening in the present day of the same family. And so there's this very intense and stark adventure story that is taking place in Norway, way up in Hammerfest. Well, I'm going to get the name wrong of the actual, well, it's in Hammerfest and in other places. It's up in Norway, that focuses a lot on a person who's sort of the patriarch of a lineage that's gotten disconnected from the other person's life that is focused on here, which is a woman named Greta, who's living and struggling with her marriage in modern day Minnesota. And so the stories they're what I like about them is that they are parallel, and it's not as much that they're intertwined. So there's not a cleverness to it. It's more that the tones are reverberate back and forth, and the issues reverberate back and forth between. She's I think great, maybe missing a great granddaughter, and so I don't want to say things or spoil things, but what struck me so much, and I'm going to ask some different. First of all, is there something I should have said about framing the sort of essential nature of how the story is told?
I think that's just perfect for our purposes. Okay.
Yeah. So, there's a darkness, and there's a femininity, and there is a starkness, and there's a physicality, and all of these things kind of work together in this that I think is really powerful. And so I have many questions. I think that one of the ones I want to start with is just a very, very simple technical craft question before I get into the ones that are probably onerously, heavy in some ways. But so what do you feel that you get out of, what are the distinct ranges that you get out of writing in non-contemporary prose styles and then in contemporary prose styles? That there's because I think that, obviously you need to have the tones sound right for their time, but then I also would imagine that there's a kind of range you can get with each of them that you can't quite, that they overlap, but that there's another. What are the things that you found to be either pleasurable or not pleasurable, but what could you get at that you couldn't get in one sort of contemporary voice?
Well, I love that question, and partly because it's such a difficult one to answer for a couple of reasons. One, and I have thought about quite often and been asked about often enough how you access a voice from 100 years ago or more than 100 years ago in a place that you're not from, you being me, that I'm not from. Right. And how do you try to authenticate that? How do you try to bring it to life in a way that's more than plausible, that's hopefully lends a layer of texture or meaning or something that you wouldn't otherwise have? Right. And the answer to that question is so difficult because so much of Ode voice, Ode being the character from that long ago, is instinctual. And it's
Right.
just how I imagine someone in his situation in that place at that time would think and talk and those sorts of things, which is totally unsatisfying even to hear myself say it. Like there should be a really good answer to that question. Um, but it is difficult. And of course, I've read a lot of books. I've read all of Knut Hamsun's books, which are mostly set around this time. So I feel like I have some access to how Norwegians were speaking, at least in translation, and at least through the lens of this very
Right.
particular literature, and lots of other literature of that part of the world as well from that period of time. But that's weak. That's almost like plagiarism or something. So it really is. I mean, it's imagination. And the other
Right.
thing that I joke about, or have joked about in the past anyway, is that the sort of stoicism that comes with his voice,
Mhm.
with all of the voices from that period, whenever someone is speaking or thinking, there's a kind of quiet reserve that is, I think, still very much a part of people who are descendant from this part of the world. And I've joked repeatedly, it's a terrible joke, but I'll say it again, that to hear these people speak, all you have to do is go to the Scandinavian Market on Lake Street in Minneapolis the week before Christmas and watch the old couples communicate with each other.
Yeah.
There's a lot of head nodding and looking away in disgust and those sorts of gestures that communicate as much as any words do. And in the case of these people, are often used in lieu of or in place of actually talking to each other. And so that's part of it. But that just barely begins to answer the question. And I think that for me, the larger project of putting these two storylines next to each other is to do exactly what you said they do, which is to sort of reverberate off of each other. The word that I use in my mind when I'm working is to amplify each other's
Oh,
voice,
yeah, that makes sense.
so that if one of the storylines is looking back or looking forward at the other, that there's something, it's almost like there's an energy that happens, a transmission or something that happens when the other is acknowledged, that makes it more symphonic. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
ambition anyway. And it's I say that like it's something that's constantly on my mind. It's not. It's something that happens as much in revision as it does in the original execution of writing anything. But my hope was and is that these two voices, as different as they are, because I do feel like they're pretty distinctive from each other, that when they're heard together, it's almost like a clashing that makes a different kind of sound, like the musical instruments that are on the wall behind you. What happens when one is played next to the other? Well, hopefully, if the musician is doing, or the musicians are doing their job, it sounds magnificent and strange and wonderful, because you don't necessarily pair those instruments together. And it's the same sort of idea with the voices, or at least that's the hope.
Yeah, I think it works. I mean, I think it works really well. I think that I think of voice as a polyphonic thing, right? And it's not this one thing. I think people talk about authorial voice, or this kind of voice, or that kind of voice, or character voice, and there's just a polyphonic nature to it, that when you really open up to different characters or different registers within the same character, that like there's you get to play with dissonance and amplitude and
Yeah.
those things. I think you do it really beautifully. One of the things that I also, before I get into the section I want to read, wanted to raise is, I think it's really interesting. So in the story, you have Greta and Franz, who are married and have been married a long time, and they have 2 kids, and they're struggling in their marriage, and it's pretty intense, the animosity in some ways, and the anger that's come up. And then you have Odd Einar and Inga, and that story where he's been missing and arrives at his own funeral in the beginning. That's in the very beginning, so I don't feel like I'm doing any spoilers there. And this sort of tale on the ice with polar bear and this kind of folk hero narrative. And I think a lot of times when I think about writing characters of that time period, I always think, you know, what is the psyche? We're so used to the psyche being a deeply interior narrative, right? In modern lit. And there's some that reserve that you're talking about, right? I actually worked for Norwegians in an old, longtime Norwegian restaurant that served lutefisk, and I hear what you're saying, you know, but there is also this idea of the psyche before Freud and Jung, and like this idea of internal reflection in the same way. That is also, I think, that you can feel that it's not just reserve. It's maybe an imagination of the interior that isn't even there yet in some respects. And that felt very, very interesting to me in that. But there's this concern that comes up in the book a couple of different places about who gets to hear a story. And I think that I wanted to ask you some things about it. What I'll say is that, I mean, it's said by a couple of different characters. There's a concern from Inga, which is the wife of Odd Einar. And there's a concern from her that if he tells the story to the reporter who wants to hear it, that he will not tell it to her. And in fact, that's somewhat true, you know, I mean, in the way that it comes out. But like, there's this idea that a story that there's an intimacy to telling the story for the first time to somebody, and that who gets to hear that is a lot about what that story means. It comes up again with him when he's talking to Marius, and he starts to say, well, who's going to get to hear that, you know, and wants to confront that question of who gets to hear the story gets carried down. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, because there's, you know, celebrity is celebrity even when it's a tiny town and everybody knows you. There is a way in which Inga is very smart in understanding that the story will not be theirs in the way, and that who he becomes out of that story is not the same as who he is. And so I don't know if you want to just say a few things about that.
Yeah,
I'm curious about how you were thinking about those parts of story and intimacy. And
well, it was front of mind for sure, and it has been for a long time. I would say, I mean, my first book came out 10 years ago, and I didn't necessarily know it then, but I was grappling with I don't even know what word I would use here, with the reasonableness of telling a story, right? Like, why no one needs to hear a story from me. I'm not interesting. I haven't lived a very interesting life. I'm not very smart. You know, the thing that I feel like I have is a good imagination and like a will to tell stories. And I was aware of that. And part of that is just the insecurity of being an unpublished writer and that sort of thing. But it's also been, I mean, and it remains, of course, very much on my mind. And one of the ways that I guess wrestle with it a little bit is to write about it. I think it's endlessly fascinating, and it's interesting because it's not a small part, an unsmall part of the Great Offshore Grounds either, which we'll get to that too. But it is, in this case, in the case of Northernmost, I mean, it was very much like, it was one of the objects of the book was to go further in my thinking and in my imagination with that idea than I had before. And I guess partly that was because I felt inadequate's too strong of a word, but like I hadn't got to the answers that I was looking for. And so the story is that Odd Einar has been left for dead on the island of Spitsbergen, which is halfway between the North Pole and the northernmost point of Norway, and returns home to his funeral. As you say, it happens in chapter 1. There's no, we're not giving anything away there. And what happens in the aftermath of that is that the people, he learns that people want this story. It's sort of the height of polar exploration, and anything that even hints at it is, as it was in real life, like it was the stuff of legend. Like everyone wanted these stories. The polar explorers were some of the great heroes and celebrities of their day, and so he's of course, you know, a microscopic version of this, but people want the story. And so right away, the profound and terrifying experience that he's had it becomes like an entity, right?
Yeah.
And
Commodified into
yes, exactly, by this newspaper reporter named Granaru, who wants, who wants to tell this story. And so already, as we begin to learn the story, it's coming through a filter, right? And that filter is, I mean, it's the filter of his own experiences told to a newspaperman who is then writing about it. He's not exactly a reliable source either. One of the things that connects Greta and in the contemporary storyline in Ode Einar is a translated version of this story from a man that she falls in love with. As you know, it's the sort of, he transcribes this story, so it goes through the filter of his translation, through the filter of all those years, and all of a sudden the story that that he lived through is like several degrees separated from his own experience. And that makes what seems to me to be a true thing, which is the stories that we live, which is, as much as I'm interested in this, in telling stories, it's because I feel like our lives are nothing but the stories that we pile up, from one year to the next. It's hardly his anymore. And it's experienced through Greta, and Greta gives it to us. And now here we are, the readers or the writer of this story, trying to make meaning out of a story that is fiction, to begin with. And it's impossible, right? And in the same way that so much of our lives, and by our lives, I mean your life, Vanessa, and mine, and the people that we know and love, and the people that we hang around with, and that we talk to, and that we work with, and whatever. It's really difficult to know someone. It's really difficult to have access to the kind of intimacy that Inger is looking for, which is, this is our story. This is what happened to you. And in order for us to, to get back together and to be whole together, how am I going to get that if I don't even get the story from you?
Right.
And so it's like a reverse telescope or something like that, or the idea of it is, again. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think that there's that actually sets up the thing I want to read pretty well too, in my mind. So there's the section I want to read is about halfway through the book, but I want to read it. You have gorgeous writing throughout here, and there's some beautiful writing here. But I chose this section more for what it has to say about some of the ideas in the book, and this question of God and faith, which from reading, right, there's a sort of like this question of, is the universe that is in my mind a lot of times, and what it means to find a peace that is neither, and you talk about it, a character talks about it here a little bit, and I wanted to read it and then ask you some questions off that. So on this scene, and I'm going to get some of the pronunciations wrong just because I haven't had much of a chance to practice them, but in this scene, Odd Einar is on a ship with a man named Svena, and he's listening to him talk, and he's asking, Svena is asking Odd Einar, like, why are you here? What is it? That's the setup. And this is on the way out to the journey that he gets lost on. But he says, you're from Hammerfest, yeah? He said, I am, sir. A fisherman, I was told. You were told true. Why have you chosen to be here? Why are you not sitting on the Sorosundet, hauling your nets? He might have well asked me to explain the stars and where they slept, for all I knew about how I'd ended up at that table, and my expression must have betrayed my ignorance. But he would not relent, and soon the others turned to me, all of them awaiting my answer. Well, as you know, Herr Sverdrup recommended me. That's not the question. I know who took you on. I even recall what Otto said in his recommendation. But a man doesn't end up on the northern edge of the world without having first looked into the depth of his soul. You, man, what did you see there? In the greasy light of the lamp swaying above the table, our eyes met. He grinned, but not kindly. Or perhaps it was the vacancy of his gaze, of its whiteness, that made him seem unkind. In any case, I saw the absence of any reflection, one thing that had led me there. I'm sorry, I saw the absence of any reflection. One thing that had led me there, and I admitted it at once, why was I failing to provide for my family? It's true. And I don't think I ever looked into the bottom of my soul, sir. The fact of my failure weighs heavily on me. And if I were able to see down there, I suspect I'd discover shame. Yes, he said, pounding his fist on the table. And so I've come here to make it right, not only my purse, but also my pride. He raised his hands as though offering a blessing. Our purse and our pride, he whispered. And then he looked around the table. My purse and my pride, he said again, his gaze shifting from man to man. And once it got back to me, he nodded and he took another spoon of stew. When I was a boy in Trondheim, my father was a pastor, and an ardent one at that. I used to spend my Sunday mornings in prayer so earnest and searching that I was often accused of absent-mindedness. To this day, I can still recall my urgent pleas. I wanted God to shine on me. I wanted to know that he loved me. I wanted to know that salvation would be my reward, yet I never felt it. All my life, I prayed for wisdom to understand. I prayed for the touch of God's love. He took the last bite from his bowl, ran his fingers around inside it, licked them clean, and then looked up into the lamplight with his snowy eyes. I prayed in churches and in taverns. I prayed in schools and in shipyards. I prayed in bunks on 20 different boats. And until that storm off Greenland coast, I prayed without answer. But there, during that 6-day storm, I found my answer. There I found my answer. And now he stepped to the porthole and cupped his hands around his eyes as he peered into the darkness. Though we had found a fine lee from that storm, Singditstjerna rocked, so did Sven his body. And he stood. I'm going to actually stop here for 1 second and just jump to where he goes to a little bit, because I know that I'm not supposed to read all that long, but he starts talking about what he saw in the storm. And he says, the eternal snow, he whispered, it was the answer to my lifetime of prayers. And later he says, and it is also where truth will be found. The last line I want to quote out of this section is, Svena asked, why would you put faith in any God when all this is around you? Heaven or hell, what's the difference? And the reason that I really love this section and wanted to ask you about it is that there is this idea of the truth in and of itself, this wholeness of truth, this vastness of truth that is in the present, and that ties you to your animal nature and your experience when you let go of thinking that it matters if you survive, or if you are great, or if you become this, or if you become that sort of ambitionless moment as being a place of deep freedom, but not in the way that I think people talk about Zen attachment. I mean, like there's a sort of corollary, but there's also kind of a way in which is different. I think it is a form of meditation in some ways, a meditation on like the present, but it's not. And so one of the things that brought to mind for me is, and maybe I'll get some of this wrong, but like there's a whole discussion in the Talmud and stuff around Isaiah, and that shows up in the Siddur for Jewish practice, where the original line that gets used in the daily prayers out of the Torah actually is from Isaiah, and it says essentially, it's the great terrifying monotheism. God made everything. God made everything that is great and everything that is evil, right? Like it says, it is all of it. Like he made the beautiful and the terrible. He made the things that are good and the things that are evil equally. And it's such a heavy statement. It's so intense when you actually read it in the sort of liturgical form. But in the Siddur, it was sort of deemed by the rabbis of the Talmud to be like a little bit too heavy, for like how you have to pray every day. And so in going through it now says, God made the wonderful things, the good things, and everything. Mm-hmm. And so it's the and everything is the pass that's given for the people who they're not ready for that experience of what does it mean if it's everything, and the moral ambivalence about that. I don't even know that I don't think it's actually moral ambivalence. I think it's something else. But I wanted to ask I know I'm kind of giving you a lot of me, and I don't mean to. What I want to know is, in this novel and in this way of thinking about it, where your characters are at, can you talk about what kind of faith is discovered in some ways, or just go from there and tell me how you'd like to talk about it? But I mean, at one point, two characters both talk about holy ineptitude, talk about ineptitude as being a sort of basis of faith as well, and to me, that's also that kind of fragility of life. So I think it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
I mean, it's so complicated for me still. And I think that one of the reasons that scene, which incidentally is my personal favorite in the whole book, and also feels
Really? I
like,
had no idea.
yes, and also feels in so many ways, I don't know, gratuitous or something. Like it was just so much fun, and it had to be there for me. But maybe it's too much, and you know, like you always have those. Or I anyway always have those thoughts. But what I was wondering about, and what I continue to wonder about, so there's an intersection of, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 things, and I think that this will be a wonderful sort of way to transition from talking about Northernmost to talking about the Great Offshore Grounds. But there are this sort of, I don't know, this sequence of thinking, these notions that I have, which are so half formed, and um, and probably only interesting to me. But there's first this question about, again, to go back to what we first started talking about, this, the stories that we live and the stories that we tell, and how we divine meaning from them. And this is, I'm talking about Odiner in this case. My own reflections on things like God and on things like my own life are not nearly as ethereal as Odiner's are, right? Like I'm much more concerned with getting the kitchen floor swept after the kids have had lunch than I am about whether or not there is a God. But I do think that one of the things that I've come to think, I should say, is over years, a decade and more of thinking about the sum of our lives, is that there must be something more to it, right? Like there must be a God. Even though I don't have any faith that there is one. Like it's almost like I'm waiting to be knighted or something, waited to be given evidence, waited to be shown that this is the thing that you've been looking for. And I don't expect to ever see it.
Right.
So one of the ways that I search for it is through the characters in the books. And when I think about it, like in every one of, so I've written 4 novels, and I'm finishing a 5th one now. And in every one of those stories, there's someone asking a question like that, like, look out
Right.
that window and tell me what you see. And if it's not ice and snow, then what is it? And it can be just that simple. So there's this confluence of things that I mentioned. There's the story of our lives and how they accrue and what the accrual of them looks like in the end. And when we try to make sense of who we are, when Odiner is trying to make sense of
Right.
who he is, what is that? There's the natural world, which in the case of the men on that boat is the overwhelming fact of their life at the moment. And for most of these guys who spent most of their lives hunting seals in the Arctic, it is the thing that defines whether you work or don't work, whether you live or die in most cases. And that way is this sort of God is the weather and is the landscape. And so it can be just that simple.
Right.
And then there's the question about in our real lives, in Odiner's real life, like he is ashamed. He sent his daughter off, and he must feel some sense of satisfaction in having done that and having offered her a life that he couldn't offer her in Norway. But he also has no idea what happened to her. He loves her more than anything, and she's gone. And so this is a way for him to I mean, his plan is that he's going to make enough money that he can go and see her, or he can bring her back so that they can see each other again. And it's tragic. It's
Yeah.
foolhardy. That's not going to happen. And so there he is faced with all these things, and he has to answer to his captain. He has to answer to himself, and he has to reconcile his failures with what is all around him, which is nothing but ice and snow. And so that is, I guess all of that is to say that it's one of the ways that I grapple with the question of, is there a God?
Right.
And if there is, why the hell are we meant to live the lives that we're living? Why can't it be something divine? Why can't daily life be something that's divine? And because it's certainly not for Odiner, and for most people that I know, though there may be lovely days, no one no one thinks that they're smiled upon by. I mean, all sorts of people think that they're smiled upon by God, but like it doesn't make life easier in terms of sweeping the kitchen floor. And so that's all there. And I say all that like I'm like, yes, of course, this is what I was thinking about when I wrote it, and what I continue to think about still. I don't suspect for 1 second that I'm closer to an answer, or that Odiner is closer to an answer, or that the captain, for all his cocksureness, is closer to an answer. I
Right.
don't think there is one. That's what I
Right.
think.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can. I think you've said it really well. I where I've gotten to in my own life is a lot of times like I can neither believe nor ever rule out belief. I can neither believe nor disbelieve in God.
Yeah, yeah,
And so that space of I don't know becomes a holy territory in
yeah.
some ways, and that's a space that any character can enter,
Yes.
and have their experience with the divine, whatever that is, or the lack of it.
Right. And I love that. I mean, I love that in life. I love to stand in front of a beautiful landscape, or stand next to a work of art that brings me to ecstasy, or feel love in some way that's that profound, and just rejoice in it.
Yeah.
But imagine ways that I could attempt to translate that experience into something on the page. But I also know, and I'm not being modest here, I also know that I will fail in the translation of that experience every single time, because there are limits to the powers of my imagination. There are limits to the language that I have, or that anyone has, to express the feelings that we have in that moment.
Well, and in part because the complexity of feelings in that moment is that everything is there simultaneous, and the nature of writing is it must be put into a list.
Yeah.
Right. And therefore has a totally different character, even if you were to try to
Yeah. Well, speaking of lists, so we've talked way too long about Northernmost, and I want to turn our attention to the Great Offshore Grounds. And I actually want to begin by reading a page from the book, because I think, I mean, I like you, I have like 20 like 3 typewritten pages. I think I'm only going to get to 1 or 2 of the questions, because there's just so much material in this book, and I love the confluence of our stories. And I'm actually gonna, I say that, and I'm actually gonna read about the confluence of rivers. So to set this scene up, I should describe The Great Offshore Grounds by Vanessa Veselka. And this is a story. It's so hard to describe what this story is about, because it is about so many things. But at its core, it's a story of 2 sisters and a brother and a mother, and the other mother to these two young women, and their trials in identifying each other, and in identifying who they are themselves, and of who they want to become, and what they don't want to drag along with them, and who they don't want influencing their lives. And the story is told in road trips, and many scenes aboard boats up and down the west coast of America, from the west coast to the east coast, back again to the south. And it's very much, so I've read it twice now. I read it to give a blurb, and I read it again for this. And one of the things, the first time I read it, I was like, this is such an amazing story about these two really strong and independent and beautifully minded women who just don't want to take shit from anyone, who are not conventional in any way and don't aspire to be, and are so smart and so out of step with America, right? Like like what we see when we turn on the television or what we see when we read the newspaper. These are not those people. These are people who struggle to survive. They struggle to pay their rent. They struggle to have money for food. And there's so much beautiful dignity in that. And I just love it. And the quest that you send them on is the first one anyway, is they're at their father's wedding, their father who they don't know and certainly don't care about, but are there well for food, but also I think from a morbid sense of curiosity. At least that's how I would be about it. And what he gives them, what this father gives them on his wedding day, is a name that they've never known before or heard before, which is the name of one of their mothers. That's the story. The mythology of their family is that this man, a man named Cyril, has impregnated two women who both gave birth at the same time, and he left, and one of the mothers left, and neither of the women know, nor do we know, whose mother is whose, which child belongs to which mother. And the name that he's given them is the name of the other mother. And so these two sisters who are, it's one of the most powerful relationships I've read in such a long time. They're so connected. They drive each other crazy. They're both so flawed and so wonderful, but they've just gotten on the road. So they've been to the wedding. They have this name. They have different feelings about going, but they're driving through I think the chapter is called the Great American Desert, but they're now in Montana. So this is perfect, although it's Missoula, or a few hours past Missoula. A few hours past Missoula, the land changed again, flattening and turning brown, scoured by wind. They crossed the Yellowstone River, then followed it as it ran north by northeast, fed by the Yellowstone Lake. It had poured over the falls and through the Black Canyon before they ever knew it. Past Billings, the Yellowstone joined the Bighorn, which carried with it the Little Bighorn and the Tongue. As they drove, they saw signs of reenactments. Custer, stand with or against, your choice. And they heard talk in the rest area of a magnificent new state-of-the-art jail created from nothing but investor money and high-interest loans. Then they came to the Great Powder River, which was fed by the Little Powder as well as oil from pipeline breaks. Red Cloud's War, the benzene as it joined the Yellowstone which already had inherited so much, the Bighorn and the wind and the Tongue as it flowed toward the Missouri River, which had no choice but to inherit the watershed as it drained toward the Mississippi, that unstoppable force. And maybe there just is no way out of history. No matter how much you want to come from a different story, you can't. They traveled from high elevations and scrubland to prairie to chain stores and settled into the doldrums of flat grass, sunburnt and feral, another unwelcome thing upon the land. After Miles City, they dropped south of the hunting grounds of the Crow people. In the periphery, Livy saw a new future, free again. Cheyenne saw a woman with a changing face. Now this, now that, the mother narcotic. Maybe a different past would mean a different future. Maybe there was another history to claim. Passing through the Black Hills, north of Mount Rushmore and Pine Ridge, south of the Bakken Formation and Standing Rock, they drove the Badlands. And on it goes, this trip to discover their other mother. And that story, which I will definitely not give away, but becomes such a source of tension for both of them and such a propulsive part of the storytelling, and such an ingenious and subtle propulsion it is. I must say, I love that. Of course you would be curious. Of course these women are curious about who their mother is and their ways, but of course they would resist it too. My question after reading that, and I one of the things that I really loved about this book, Vanessa, is how much you delve into the same questions about the myths that make us and the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we come from. And in the case of this excerpt, it says, I'm going to quote you here, maybe there is no way out of history. No matter how much you want to come from a different story, you can't. And that is so much a part of their life, even as they're so willful about forging their own story and writing their own story, living their own story. I guess my question is, do you believe the statement in this scene that you can't come from a different story? Do you think either in life or for Livy and for Cheyenne?
I think that like how you were answering the question about, God, it's kind of like that. It's the unending question for me on the one hand, because both are true, right? Like meaning, so when the line, when the narration poses the question, and maybe you can't come, from another history, or there's no way out of history. That's a very, also in the book, a very white perspective on that moment too, because they're very, they're aware. It's more in the setting of the book. That this is stolen land, man. Like these are Americans in the sense of being, Americans that were not Native Americans, that like come in generations of immigration or other things with their own myths, their own stories, their own like kind of backgrounds in. And there's a there's a deep desire to sort of be free of all the weight of what this country has and brings, whether that's manifest destiny, whether that's slavery, whether that's big, so like it can be any capitalism, like whatever it is, the constriction of what's all there that says this is who you have to be is something that they, I think, are not always consciously, but railing against this role of what it means to be here in this place. And at the same time, there's a personal history that, they're also contending with one character more than others. I think that as an American, it's very hard for me not to ask myself all the time, does the American project work? What kind of histories are we trapped in? What do we get to remake? One of the great gifts of this, of our American culture is also one of the great dangers, which is the ability to reinvent, and the ability to reinvent endlessly can become just a mindless lack of ethical, substance that's just a constant commodification of personality as, niche marketing to oneself, where everything is a branding experience, and then the other side of that is the ability, like I've also seen people like completely reinvent their stories and become incredible forces. I've seen that a lot in queer culture, more like I've really witnessed that a lot in my life personally, more I think with with watching in the ways that people of my generation would come out in different ways and sometimes take on a new name or take on a new something and like be very fabulous or very, very different or very intense and carve for themselves a character that they wanted to live into. And I think that there's something incredibly beautiful about that reinvention. And then I think there's something incredibly problematic about the way we can so easily reinvent and cut ties. And both are true for these characters, and they're in their early 30s. And, there's things with one of them that she would prefer to leave behind. She'd much prefer to have a different history that tells a different story. And even the name of one of the characters, Cheyenne, is the mother who, Kirsten, this is a very small thing, but you find out, so it's not a spoiler of any kind. In passing, it's mentioned, late in the book that she, when they were in third grade, like when they were, going to school, she told them they were immigrants, that they came from like the old country. Like the old country to her was like, her parents' mentality. She just like cut ties, and so they actually were telling people they were immigrants and they were like new to the country when they were like tiny, because that was how she viewed it. And, Cheyenne was named Cheyenne because at one point Kirsten had the idea that maybe she came from some kind of Native American, and she doesn't. And so Cheyenne's just stuck with the name. And it's just this sense of where reinvention is this fantastic, they're poor, right? Like, and reinvention is what gives the edge or the grift or the way through things. That ability to recreate who you are is a big feature of people who can navigate, American finance and culture at the sort of hustle level. And I love that. I love that creativity. And at the same time, it's problematic. Those histories.
Yeah,
I do
and
feel like we're inextricable. I don't think we get to walk away from it.
yeah.
You know,
What's so interesting is that I mean, both Cheyenne and Livy, and I'll be absorbing them for a long time to come and thinking about them for a long time to come. But their personal projects are so different from each other's, as much as they're bound by this. So, well, and I shouldn't say bound, that's the wrong word, but as curious as they are about who Anne is and whose daughter, right? And one of the ways that they go about investigating this question is by sort of scattering all over the place, and they do that without hardly any resources at all. I mean, you mentioned hustling and the grift. They are a couple of the best hustlers and grifters that I've ever seen, and I love that about them. There's this. I remember reading through it the first time, and I was like, how are they going to make this work? Just that simple question, like, where are they going to get the money? They got to get here, they got to get there, and it's a constant conversation, and I love that. But the effect is that it's almost like taking a handful of marbles and just throwing them across the room, and that's the trajectory of their life. And at first, that feeling for me was, like, oh man, I've got to keep track of this. But then I realized how integral it was to who they are. I mean, you mentioned, I mentioned that they're poor. They're the working poor, and I mean the really working poor. Like, there's a moment toward the end of the book when Cheyenne feels a sense of relief because she can stay someplace for a month or two before she gets evicted, and it's genuinely, like, I remember getting to that moment and feeling genuinely like at peace for her, like she could settle down for a month or two.
Yeah.
All of which is a way of getting to this question, which, and I'm going to shift, this is going to seem to make no sense at all, I hope it does. My favorite scene in your book is the scene when Livy goes aboard the I had to write the name of the ship down. The Neva, is that the name of the boat? The tall ship.
Yeah.
And she's new to this. She is a seasoned sailor. She spent years in Alaska yes, thank you. In Alaska fishing for halibut, and she's had a terrible recent experience in Alaska, and her way out of Alaska, again, one of those marvels going across the floor, is to join the crew of this tall ship, this reenactment ship. And first of all, I got to that chapter and was just amazed at the level of detail and the ease with which you incorporated it. Like, I've researched things like this in the past, but never felt like I had a handle the way that I was like, oh, for sure, the author of this story has lived this exact life, which it turns out you have, and we'll get to that in a second too. Well, not her whole story, but that you've worked on these boats. But so there's all this beautiful imagery and description of her climbing the shrouds and tending to the masts and working with the sails and the fear that attends that, and everything is sort of as it would be. There's fog and there's slickness and there's danger and there's and there's so much to keep track of. There's people shouting from every direction, asking her to shout back the orders and things like that. And I was like, this is a perfect sort of capsule of this novel altogether. All these things that are happening all around, but there's this very sort of there's a job that has to be done. And in the case of Livy's time on the boat, she's got to do her job, literally do her job, whatever it is at that moment. And for her in the larger project, at first it's going to find her mother. Later it's it's much more about her finding her own contentment and her own happiness and love. I don't want to turn it into a sap story, but there is such a beautiful love story between her and one of the women that she cruised with on this boat. But I was just wondering if that was like, if you wrote that scene with it being a microcosm of the larger story in mind, or if that's just an accidental happenstance of the storytelling, or what. And I also want to hear, and I hope you'll tell us about your experience working on a ship like this.
Well, and not to make too much of it, I spent just under a month working as a sail trainee on a book called I'm sorry, on a brig, brig Niagara, which is up on the Great Lakes, and did most of my sailing up for all the Great Lakes, which is very intense to sail in, actually, because the ocean, has its own. The waves are much bigger. If you go down, it's terrible. At the same time, a lot of ocean sailing, other than getting on and off dock, is trade winds, right? So you kind of set the sails and you end up with a little more time on your hands in some ways. And in the Great Lakes, line squalls come up really fast, like things come up really fast. And when you have like 14 sails, and you move one, you got to move them all. So it's constant tacking, it's constant like shifting. So the sort of pace of running all the time and having multiple commands being shouted at you that you have to answer back in certain ways. So if somebody says, starboard watch, set the topmast staysail, right? Like, and you're running in those areas, if you move one thing, then you're also moving the other. Like, to move one side, to pull on one side, you have to push on the other, like a lot of times. And so you're splitting and kind of like trying to sort all this stuff out really fast. And so on the ship that I was on, it's like 198 lines belayed to deck, in the pin rail. I mean, it was a lot of things. And so, I was no great tall ship sailor. So I always sort of say it with a lot of humility. I worked in the sense that we were undercrewed and for a variety of reasons in that summer. And it was like 18-hour days and, sleeping in these really tight hammocks. We were like shoulder to shoulder because the below decks, which I did take out of the Niagara, are only like 5'2" in Niagara because they want the water, they want the carronades. It was a military ship. They want the carronades to be at the water line. They don't give a fuck about the sailors. It's the way it goes. Who cares what happens to them? So there's a lot of those kind of detail that came out of that time working, even though the ship is not identical to it. But the question of writing it, did I write that scene? That scene was a very important scene to me, particularly where it ends up. And I wanted it to really contain some of the moment, try to get at a sense of the first time I went aloft, and what it felt like in those moments and being up in the dark. One of the things I didn't know until I, did this, was, it seems such an obvious thing. You think, oh, you still sail in the dark. Like, obviously you still sail in the dark, but you can't use lights. So, there's red light you can use below, and maybe there's a little bit of red light, but you actually have to train. You can't use what we think of as regular light. So you're working aloft, or you're working in things in the dark. Like, if there's a big moon, that's one thing, but you're working in the dark. You're sailing in the dark. Like, there is a way in which you live in that world. They're just very different. We were in a storm. It wasn't a terrible storm, but it was a chop. Things were getting thrown sideways, and there's somebody who swears they saved my life. I think that's probably true, but that could have, it was more just because a whole big heavy thing wasn't latched properly and was going to go over, and I was sleeping underneath. They grabbed it. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't mean to tangent off on that. So the details of writing that were to me to be very physical, but I would never say that I'm a tall ship sailor. Like, the people who are real tall ship sailors are remarkable. And I was somebody who was just working very hard to not be a terrible weight. Like, I mean, they needed my body weight, right? Like, they needed somebody to sweat the line. You need a lot of people to dig and hold. Like, you need a certain number of people to sail a ship. But like, my great internal merit as a sailor was not needed, nor did it arrive, the question though is that scene to me was not something where I said this is, but there is one that was, and that is the scene with the castle in Texas. And
My next question, Vanessa.
oh, so yeah, and I thought about that in reading your book too. This question of what you were talking about with God and snow and not mattering if you live or die. This question of like when did you become okay with being nothing? This kind of sense is very much also in that. So
It's such a magnificent scene for those who haven't read the book, and everyone should read this book. Cheyenne is on another journey back to a new lead in her search for the other mother. And Kirsten, the mother who has raised her, has given her her car and sent her on her way to help facilitate this search. And she's driving across Texas, I believe, is where the tornado happens. And her car is swept off and destroyed. And all of a sudden she's standing alone in the middle of Texas, and a castle appears before her. And it's such a beautiful and funny and mysterious set piece in a novel that's otherwise constantly moving. Like that whole scene, of course there's movement in the scene, but it's so contained, and it feels like the entire world of the novel, even though, and it's a real castle that a man is really building, but it's also a poor man's castle, I guess would be one way of saying it. And I'm just dying to know where the idea came from, and how you see it functioning in the story.
So some of this was just pure luck. I was actually a friend of mine who's a writer, Johnny Evison, has a cabin that he and his family, that he writes at and lives at. Like he's got, he and his kids are there. It's a fairly small but lovely place up near Squim. And he asked me if I wanted to go up there for a couple of weeks and write. He was very generous. And I was walking all over that area, and I saw, and it's not quite like it is in my book, but I saw something that looked like a castle. And so I went up and in, and I saw, and it was a mason, and he was building something that was sort of like a castle. I took it to a little bit of an extreme, but there are a couple pieces that came from came from him, but in part because I had lived in hitchhiked and traveled around and played guitar in a kind of somewhat indigent way in the late 80s in the Eastern Bloc and Yugoslavia and Turkey and also Austria before the wars. And then I was also in Austria and living with Czechs when the wall came down, when the revolution happened. And I knew a lot of Czechs. I lived, and I'm Czech by descent, so I knew a lot of Czechs. And I was also born in Texas, so that Czech-Texan history is really deep and familiar to me in that area. The tree that I was writing about is similar to a tree that's in Dubina. But I think that when I put it together with the character, I remembered so much because of my age. I was, a teenager, late teens, when I was traveling in that way. But I met people from an earlier generation, right? Because most of the people I was meeting were not my age, they were older than me. And so they were people who had grown up under, the sort of dilapidation of, Soviet Russia. They'd grown up in a certain kind of culture that was very familiar to me at the time, where there was this real sort of America's freedom that wasn't as simple as like freedom being like blue jeans and rock and roll, freedom being very much this kind of, so that question that character has about like, what does real freedom look like? Is it the freedom is this just the freedom to buy anything we want if we have the money? Is that what this freedom means? Like what about the freedom to be a human? Right. And like, so there's this way that he's trying to make something beautiful out of what he has. at the same time that he knows that it means nothing in this way. And so that part of it came from, like, I saw somebody trying to build a very, very small Gothic, structure. And I went in and talked to the man,
Yeah.
of course. And he did tell me he was a fruitarian. And I said, that's not going to work out that well. And we talked about heavy metal. So that part came in essence from me wanting to put him in that scene. But the real character came from a lot of those people that I'd met over the years. And I wondered, what would they be? I met them in 87. I met them in 88. I met them in 89. What do they see now? Some of them will have been here, or they've lived in, all over in the West. And like, what do they see now? And that sense of beauty. And yeah. So.
Well, and it has that like a fully, I mean, she discovers it, Cheyenne does, on the heels of this terrific storm, right? Where like her situation has, for as hopeless and helpless as it is sometimes seen, is never more hopeless or helpless than it is in that moment. Right. And yet she finds in that exchange, is the guy's name Yuri? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, I mean, I pronounced it Yurshi, but like we went through a whole thing. I'm like, how do you represent that on the page? And it was like, don't bother.
Yeah.
It's the Czech version of George, essentially.
Okay. But he's this man, and I mean, his project is so simple to the extent that he even like, there were two details. One, he lent someone his truck so that he couldn't take any more jobs in his real job, so that he could work on his castle. And there's another such example that's escaping me right now. But she finds in that, as she would, right, because of who Cheyenne is and how she's walking through the world, like the peace and tranquility that I felt, like the peace that came over me in that scene was just so terrific and so complete. And not only is it just fabulous and a beautiful scene, but that was so welcome, that at that moment for her to have a moment's reprieve when it seemed like no such thing was ever going to exist for her again.
And there's a remarkable, so these questions of how you get from point A to point B and how you travel like this and how you do it, like, not to be, I've done it. Like, I know what that's like. Mm-hmm. And there is this remarkable kindness that can be experienced alongside every danger. Mm-hmm. And it's a kindness that's born out of like, I see you and you see me, and I've been where you are, and I will only see you for a minute. What do you need in this minute? Like, it's a very different thing than what when you're meeting people who are like you in that interaction, rather than meeting somebody who's just, another kind of person who's just like, hey, can I buy you lunch? It's like, yeah. That's wonderful. That's necessary. That's a very different intimacy. Yeah. Than people who will just literally take you in for, to share a terrible spot on the floor. And like, hey, I'm staying with this guy. Do you want to come stay with me? You know what I mean? Like, it's.
Well, and I suppose we should yes, there's Jess, even as we speak.
Yeah, Libby, I was going to say, we've been going for like.
That same kindness is visited on Libby too, yes. in one of her direst moments too, and maybe that'll be where we can pick up the conversation next time, Vanessa.
Yes.
But to the audience.
Yes. Well, just a reminder, audience, feel free to pop your questions into the chat or into the Q&A function down there at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. But I thought I might throw a question your guys' way. Particularly, I think I'm going to start with Vanessa and then pivot to Peter. But I'm curious how you, because so much of the Offshore Grounds is sort of this road trip and this travel. And I'm curious about how you worked towards imbuing that there's still a sense of place in that, even though there aren't necessarily like routes as you move around. And so I'm curious how that sort of process and that research and those sorts of things worked for you And then kind of to contrast that, how that worked out for you, Peter, with Northernmost, and that idea of just being in this tiny town, and being in a community that is so entrenched.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that the narrator, I mean, okay, so Peter and I have the same editor, and a wonderful man named Tim O'Connell. And I don't know, I think, Peter, you may or may not have had him throughout the process. I don't know fully because I was reading your acknowledgements. I wasn't sure. But
Yeah.
But one of the things that Tim said to me at one point, you know, is he said, this narrator, when we were doing some edits on something, he's like, it's the problem is it sounds like the voice of all history ruminating on itself. And I said, it's supposed to, you know, like that was my thing, is it's supposed to sound like all, so we had to sort of split the difference on like what we thought was okay about that. But like, it was a lot more present in the initial versions. And the reason I mention that is that place, the familiarity that I think comes from the sense of place, the place is America, right? But the familiarity that ties the different settings within that together is that there is a narrative inclination towards the same kinds of questions about what place means, and the same kind of like tonal language and push. The idea of what is beautiful and what is disturbing and what is unanswered stays pretty steady through the descriptions of it. So I think it's sort of like, just technically my intention was to try to, like, the place is America. I wanted it to be that expanded. But that, so that when there are these insertion points, and that was a hard thing to try to get right. And like, you know, jury's out on whether I did, but like that was a very tricky thing for us to try to navigate with that. You know, I was definitely all of history ruminating on itself, and Tim was a little bit like, give us a little more context, because like, so if you saw earlier drafts, they were like, it was, you know, the things that seem really obvious to me, like as connections, are like, you know, a little bit like if you're talking to somebody who's been up on acid for 3 days, and you know, it makes sense. They're saying Mr. Rogers, Reynolds rap, Mr. Rogers, Reynolds rap, and it's just like, it makes perfect sense. But you miss a couple of steps on that chain, and like, it's not all readers are going with you. So I think it was bad, but that's what I mean. Yeah.
It occurs to me, Vanessa, like even the section that I read, which is so beautifully describing the rivers coming together, you know, and the tributaries of the Mississippi, and it felt like those rivers in that scene, in the highways and other scenes, in the coast and other scenes, are like the arteries of the continent, coursing life through the landscape. And it feels very much American. I'm sure that this will be like, I don't know, if someone said this to me, I would be embarrassed, but the Melvillian aspect of that, where like, this is the way that they are traveling all over the place and stopping in towns in every state, it seems like sometimes. I mean, that feels like the project, right? Like, and it comes alive in a way that's authentic and super meaningful as far as this reader is concerned, at least.
Thank you very much. Very kind.
Yeah. For me, I mean, one of the things, especially about the Norwegian part of the novel, is that it was just like, it was cast, and I had made that choice 10 years ago when I was writing The Lighthouse Road. And I made it by picking a town on a map that had a cool name and was as far north as I could get. And it was just that simple. So I was like, it was preordained by, you know, whatever hand had dealt me the instinct. Yeah, exactly. And the instinct to choose that particular town. But I'll tell you that one of the things that happened, and I don't know exactly if this gets to the question or not, Jess, but there was a feeling that I had for years and years. I had never been to Hammerfest. I'd never, I'd done all the online research I could do. On this bookshelf back here, there's all sorts of books about Hammerfest, but I had never been there. Though I felt like I had spent a considerable part of my life there, and like that my family was even from there. They're not. But I had that feeling for me because I had spent so much time in my imagination there. And when I finally did go to visit to do research for Northernmost, it came alive and it sort of presented itself to me, even contemporary Hammerfest, in a way that was like in lockstep with my imagination. And I don't know if that's a chicken and an egg thing, or if I, if I just willed it to be so or what. But once that was, made true to me, I was even more intent on sort of making it giving it almost a claustrophobic feel.
Yeah, that's how I felt about it. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And partly because it's in contrast with Odd Einer's experience out on the ice, which is almost like in that place too, which I hadn't spent as much time imagining, but which is the exact opposite of America, right? Like nobody was ever from Svalbard or Spitsbergen. It's now people live there, but there's no native people. There's no history of humanity. A few polar explorers, until oil was discovered or until coal was discovered, and then then there's the usual robber barons. But that place is just expansive, and it's lifeless almost, except for the polar bears and the whales and the walruses and so that expansiveness was in contrast to the confining small town.
Yeah, I felt it was like Kubrick-like claustrophobia in times. It just felt like so clearly compressed in this sort of palpable intensity. I don't know.
Well, we have a question from the audience. The characters in both of your novels are so vivid and developed. Is there anything you learned from your characters from occupying their lives in a sense and during the writing process?
I'll jump in, Vanessa, because the answer for me is like almost how to live. Yeah. Like the answer is yes, I've learned a lot from them. And it's another thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and I'm not one of those people at all, though I don't judge people who are like, the characters came in and took over and they made choices on their own. I know that that's not the case for me, that it's all a reflection of my own intellect and imagination and morality and all of that. But one of the great rewards, frankly, of writing books and of reading books too, is that you get the vicarious experience of characters. I could never be a fisherman from Norway in 1897 who sent his daughter off to America. Like I can't be that, but I can inhabit that character. And so all of his experiences and all of his wife's experiences and all of his daughter's experiences become my experiences. And in a way, I'm allowed to grow from them, and I'm allowed to learn things about myself that I wouldn't otherwise know. So the answer is definitely, and to the point where now that I'm, done writing about this family, like the sense of loss is palpable, and it's enormous. It's enormous, and not something that I have just gotten over. Like it's a part of the sadness of my everyday life to not be with them in the way that I have been for 10 years now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I would echo that. For me, it's less about getting to live other lives in a conscious way, but more that all of my writing is driven by questions. And these are questions I honestly can't answer, and as the characters, some pick them up or take them up and inhabit them. Sometimes I come to see through that process a kind of human compassion about something I didn't have compassion about that comes up. I think the question about failure and the question about, what if you're just not the type of person who can be in the America that is out there to be had, and or whether that's because of your mental health, whether that's because of, any number of ways, your economic capacity or your any number of things that sort of prevent you as a human from really truly participating in a certain way. And I think that I've always been really hard on myself about those things as well. And so there were some moments I wrote this book with there were several years of writing this book where I was in deep depression and despair in a lot of ways. And I wrote through them every day, in part because I was absolutely convinced, and I do think this is true, that if I had stepped away for 1 minute, I would never have gone back. That like I was already running on fumes so much that if it wasn't the one thing that I had to do, like the one thing that, God damn it, I was not leaving, then it gave shape to something that was like, kind of, frankly, I mean, it sounds dramatic, but I don't mean it to sound dramatic. It was nightmarish in that way. Like, it was a very hard time. And I had lost a lot of faith that I would ever do what I was trying to do in the book or get through it or anything like that, but I was not going to walk away from it. And so it was this thing that, like, I look back and I go, well, I probably made a couple of years far more miserable than they needed to be if I trusted that experience and just sort of stepped back and took care of my mental health a little bit better. But I just didn't think I'd sit back down again. I just didn't. I felt the only way out was through. And through that, I think I started to see through different characters and different, like Yoshi, like other things, elements of voices that were speaking to sorrows that I did have and things I couldn't answer that allowed me to see the beauty in it in a different way. That didn't feel constructed in that sense, but they felt, and I do start my work by free writing dialogue. And I just free write dialogue until, like, because you say one thing and then somebody says something against it. And then people shape themselves alongside that. And so I do use a very sort of free writing kind of random, occurrence things. And so I think in writing those kinds of things, that's how it would emerge. And then, of course, I would revise, I would be shaping and highlighting those things. So I learned a lot by writing it in many ways, so.
Thank you. Well, I feel like that sort of sense of grief and sense of looking at those mental health processes and things jumps us into this next question. The querent is curious about what your experience launching these novels under these pandemic conditions has been like, and if it has particularly informed anything about recent discussions of your work or made you think about your writing differently.
Here, you go first, because you got your date bumped initially.
I did, yeah. It was 4 months. It was delayed for 4 months. And what happened during those 4 months, I mean, everyone knows the story of our country in a large part of the world over those 4 months and the month since, and in the couple months even before that, which is to say the last 6 months, 7 months. But it is sort of terrifying a time as it's been in the country, and not just because of the pandemic, but because of all of everything else that's happening in this country and all of the civil unrest and all of the Black Lives Matters, the conversation around Black Lives Matters, all of that has absolutely, I mean, you would have to be blind and ignorant to not have it affect how you view your own work, and to frankly despair a little. Like, it is certainly in my lifetime, I'm 50 years old, it's the worst. Nothing even comes close to it in terms of what life is like in our country right now and in the world. And so it really, on the one hand, I have put it, I guess, into a different context, my work, and taken it less seriously and been more mindful of the world outside of my own imagination, which I think is a good thing. But it is also sort of, in a weird way, Vanessa, it was really interesting listening to you answer the last question, talking about how if you stepped away from when you were writing the Great Offshore Grounds, you knew you would never go back to it, or you feared you would never go back to it. And my own experience with work now is the same. Like if I don't get up, I get up every morning at 5 o'clock and I work for a couple hours and then take care of the kids and then work for a couple hours more. If I don't do that, I feel like I'm just like a ball of yarn that is going to just be strung out and unraveled forever. And so it's been the thing that keeps me together, even as I am more mindful every day of the injustices in this country and of the problems that we face as a civil fucking society. Like it, and you would have to be, I don't know how you can't be affected by that now, how you can't be changed by that now.
Yeah. So I always have this, one of the things that made it really hard towards the end of writing the novel as well was just this sense that, years ago I was an organizer, and like 16 years ago. And I sort of have said, I've discovered through that I was 51% artist and 49% communist. But it is a tight split in some ways. And I am a person who, whatever I'm doing, that's all I'm doing. That's my nature. Like I'm a very all in 110% to whatever I'm focused on. So I've never been somebody who's been successful at like, well, I write in this window of time. Like I've worked while I've written. That's not an issue. But like I've worked, expendable jobs that work around a schedule that works for my writing. And so that, driving nightcap, doing, things like that like made no money and caused a lot of, so there's a sort of, always outweighing the stress of money versus this or that. But the one thing that, I had not done for many years was work as a union organizer, which is something I worked with healthcare workers many years ago, helped hospital workers organize. And I ended up when the draft, when Knopf bought it and it was in the publishing, going on to its path of publishing, I took some work with a union, and so I found myself, I was only going to be doing it for 6 months. Then I was going to do it. Then I said I'd do it for 9 months, and then COVID hit, and I'm working with nursing home workers in assisted living facilities and long-term care, right? And so everything for me in the last, in February, I was like all over it. Like I was obsessive with like where PPE was everywhere before it even started to like come out. And so it was hard for me to remember that I was an artist in any way at all. I was working 60, 70 hours a week. Like I just, and everything was an emergency, and every day you get up and you go like, what have I not done that I could have done? Like every single day, it's like trying to say what could be done that isn't being done. And I'm very moved and by, whether it's home care workers or, all of these folks, the most amazing people I've met with all these incredible skills and like remarkable human beings who can do all of these different things and make $11.50 an hour because like that's what we value this at. These are the people who didn't get when they gave, when the Family First Act thing came down, and they gave people 80 hours of extra emergency sick leave. These were people who were exempted from it because they were considered too necessary, right? And there's a whole way that labor for like women and people of color and all that, like they don't get to own their labor, right? Like you're too necessary. We can't afford to have you get sick and take sick time. You got to show up, right? Like, so living in that kind of stuff, it was really hard all spring to even think about the book coming out. It was really hard. And then to think about, well, so now what do I do? So I'm staying on a little longer. And there's a grief in that because I will not write. And so I've been there about 1.5 years. And, I know that, if I stay for another section of this cycle, that for the time I'll be there, I will not write. And I'm also making that call right now. But I do believe absolutely that the fact that I won't be writing during this time, I will still be moving forward as an artist, so that when I sit to write, I will not have lost any time. I may lose career, options, but I will not have, as an artist, have lost anything. And so that's okay. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, on a final sort of self-serving question, and one I commonly ask, what are you reading?
Oh, right now I'm catching up because I have not been reading at all for the last year and a half. And so I'm really catching up on some things that I'm going back and reading I haven't read since I was 18, and some things that are brand new, and I just finished Peter's book and reading Orange World by Karen Russell, and really happily and excitedly waiting her next one, which is coming out in about 5 minutes, and I'm supposed to get a copy of. And I just, I've been reading through Lydia Yuknevich's short story collections, and I'm rereading East of Eden that I haven't read since I was 18, and really sort of going back into just interesting to look at Steinbeck. So those are the big ones. I read mostly Dead Things recently. I read, so those are some of them. I always feel like I know I'm missing a lot of other things, but right now I'm just trying to voraciously catch up with the literary world at all.
Yeah, likewise. So a couple of books that, it's funny that you mentioned Steinbeck. A book that I'm looking forward to most is a friend of mine here in Minnesota, a writer named William Sauter, who was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, 10 years ago or something like that, for a biography of Audubon. He's written a biography of Steinbeck, and that's coming out in October, a new Steinbeck biography, and I can't wait to read it.
Yeah,
yeah, and he's just a terrific man, and really smart and interesting, and thinks really in an interesting way. So I expect that it will be a fresh biography. And Steinbeck too is a writer that, a lot of English majors and history, I've read my share, so I'm excited about that. The two books that stick out for me most, besides Vanessa's, that I've read recently, one was a book that came out a few years ago, 4 years ago to be exact, and was also edited by Tim O'Connell, but The Nix by
The Nix is great.
Yeah. And he's a friend of mine, and I'm just so embarrassed that it has taken me this long to get to it, but life is so busy. But I read that book, and the experience of reading The Nix and reading The Great Offshore Grounds so close together has been really transformative. They're both such big-minded, fast-moving books that deal with so many important topics, but are also so beautifully constructed, and so funny at times, and so serious at times. I really loved The Nix, and I thought it was just
great.
Terrific.
Yeah.
And another book that is certainly less well known, and Vanessa, you and I were talking the other day about Louise Erdrich. There's a Minnesota writer named Linda Lagarde Grover who wrote a book called In the Night of Memory, and it's I think of it as being in the same class of writers as Louise Erdrich. I mean, which is to say, she's an Anishinaabe woman in Minnesota. She lives up in northern Minnesota, and it's just heart-stopping story of a Native woman who has to give her 2 daughters up for foster care, and the trajectory of their lives after that. And it's so beautiful and so devastating in the way that the way that so many of Louise Erdrich's books are beautiful and devastating. And I read it and was shaken for days afterwards.
And what's the name of that one again?
In the Night of Memory. Her name is Linda Lagarde Grover.
Okay.
And it's In the Night of Memory. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Don't forget to visit booksincommonnw.com to pick up your copies of The Great Offshore Grounds and Northernmost. Thank you to Vanessa and Peter for joining us this evening. It was an absolute delight to get to listen to you guys discuss these two books. And I'm so excited to see the future for them. Do tune in on the Thursday for more Books in Common. We've got great authors coming up, so you can check out the upcoming calendar when you tune in to purchase those books. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
Good
so
night,
much,
everyone.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Vanessa,
Bye,
thank you. Lovely conversation.
Bye, sisters.